For our assignment on Reconstruction Arguments, you're going to be looking at several secondary sources and examining ways in which those sources can be supported by the evidence that comes from the textbook, from the lecture. One of the things that you have to do in evaluating and understanding arguments is figure out how evidence might be used to support or refute or even modify a historian's argument or even your own argument. Support's pretty easy. You've been doing that a lot in short answer questions where you look for a specific piece of evidence that agrees with the thesis that the author has. Refute's pretty easy in the sense that you have to find a piece of evidence that would prove that author wrong. Modify is probably the hardest because that is a situation where you have to look at a piece of evidence that will add another layer of nuance or meaning to the argument. It's the equivalent of saying, I agree with your argument, but let's modify it, change it just slightly. Our first source is Heather Cox Richardson, a noted Civil War Reconstruction scholar, who is arguing that Reconstruction failed because Northerners abandoned it. It's not the South's fault, it's the North's fault. And you could support this with Grant's refusal to use federal troops to protect African American rights, to stop violence like in the Colfax and Opelousas massacres. You could look at the election of 1876 and the following compromise in which Northern Republicans were willing to walk away from Reconstruction in exchange for getting the presidency. You could even look at the Supreme Court cases of 1873 and 1883, which show Northerners willing to abandon the 14th and the 15th Amendments and allow the states to mistreat and abuse African Americans' rights. Eric Foner's argument in source 2 is that Reconstruction is a failure, and even more so a failure because it actually facilitated the spread of racism. The Supreme Court cases, Cruikshank and the civil rights cases, are pretty good evidence that Reconstruction embedded racist procedures and policies and laws into the fabric of American society. It allowed for segregation and the mistreatment that we'll see for the next 100 years. The KKK is also evidence that racism was allowed to spread. You could push back on Eric Foner here and argue whether or not Reconstruction ever meant to actually end racism, or was it even possible for racism to be eliminated or at least reduced in its scope and power? Our next source, 3, argues that Republicans wanted to extend rights to newly freed people because that was how they were going to get political power in the South. If Republicans want to win Southern elections, they're going to have to make sure that African Americans have civil rights and voting rights. 2 great pieces of evidence to support that would be the 14th and the 15th Amendments. Republicans were willing to use military reconstruction to force Southern states to rewrite their constitutions. So that's pretty good evidence that the Republicans intended to change Southern politics so that it would make it possible for Republicans to win elections there. James McPherson's argument is that the Civil War increased the nationalist sentiment in the United States and greatly expanded the power of the federal government, where the U.S. government is now exceptionally involved in lots of areas of American life, whereas before it had been very small and not as powerful. Proof of this would be military reconstruction. That's a pretty big, powerful use of federal authority to force Southern states to rewrite their constitutions. The Force Act of 1870 to punish the KKK and people who would intervene and limit African American rights. The Pacific Railroad Act, the federal government was willing to back the investment in building railroads. Freedmen's Bureau, the first national agency for social welfare, which McPherson hints at here in the source. Those are all proof that the US government greatly expanded its power. David Goldfield's argument is that freed people wanted independence, not separation from white folks, but their own independent base of power, and that would come from owning land. But unfortunately, Goldfield notes that they could not gain access to land, and that made it hard for them to build capital, to build political power, economic power. The most obvious proof of this that you could come up with would be the development of sharecropping, which is proof that they wanted land, but they couldn't get it, so they had to rent as sharecroppers. Richard White's argument is that racism came to shape the limits of Reconstruction policies because Northerners were racist in different ways in the South, and they were very unwilling to do much more than end slavery and grant a few civil rights to people. In fact, Northerners were a little bit nervous about expanding much more authority and power to African Americans than that. I think two good examples of this would be the Supreme Court decisions in Cruikshank and the civil rights cases, which limited African American civil rights and the power of the 14th and 15th Amendments. The liberal Republicans would be another good example of this, since they argued that the ending of slavery was really all that was needed. There wasn't much more that could be done, and African Americans just needed to figure it out for themselves. Stephen Hahn argues that Republicans were trying to secure political power in the South, and doing so meant that Reconstruction for them was to rebuild the South in a way that would mirror Northern Republican ideas. Military Reconstruction's the best example that proves this, the 14th and 15th Amendments. If you wanted to contrast this with Lincoln's 10% plan and say that Republicans were not in agreement with Lincoln's easy terms or even Johnson's easy terms, that would also prove that they had a different vision for remaking the South in a way that would make them powerful. David Blight argues that Southerners tried to rewrite the history of the war as a way of making the South the victims, but also heroes, and the Northerners are the villains. And they do this during Reconstruction as a criticism of Reconstruction itself. So what they do is they rewrite the past, they write African Americans out of the story so that they're not given any agency or power. And this would be backed up by what's known as lost cause ideology, where Southerners are trying to tell the story of the Civil War as Northern oppressors and Southerners fighting to defend their cherished ways of life. Source 9 is looking at the myth of the Redeemers, the Democrats who took over Southern states in the 1870s. These Redeemers tried to justify what they were doing by saying that black rule during Reconstruction was corrupt, and therefore they were fixing the state's politics and cleaning up these corrupt African American leaders. Redemption could be demonstrated by the Compromise of 1877, which Northern Republicans were backing away from Reconstruction in order to win the presidency. So they are rejecting the ability of Reconstruction to continue to make the South a place where African Americans can be successful. The myth of redeemers and corrupt Reconstruction politics was accepted by liberal Republicans who argued that Reconstruction needed to come to an end. It was too corrupt. You could also point out that the redemption myth ignored powerful black politicians like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, men who were passionate and powerful defenders of African American civil rights and were not corrupt. They would be complemented by mentioning other men at local and state levels who were in fact effective and good leaders, but who got smeared with a lie by these Southern Democratic redeemers. Source 10. Doug Edgerton's trying to point out here that the Compromise 1877 is often seen as the end of Reconstruction, but in fact, black office holding continues after 1877 at the federal and the state level. So it's not exactly accurate to say Reconstruction has a hard ending date in terms of the power of African Americans. You could point to Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce or other black legislators who continue to hold office into the late 1870s and 80s. But you could also push back against Edgerton's argument by saying that violence, KKK violence, Knights of the White Camellia violence, Redeemer violence, did limit the ability of black office holders to be successful. And finally, we have two contrasting Thomas Nast cartoons. Nast in the first cartoon shows Reconstruction, this myth of black incompetence, by showing how African Americans, in a really awful caricature of their intellect, are yelling and shouting instead of being peaceful, thoughtful, logical, law-abiding citizens. So he's criticizing black political leadership in this first cartoon. At the same time, on the second cartoon, he seems sympathetic to African Americans by pointing out that the white leagues, the KKK, are making freedom worse than slavery. The experience of African Americans in freedom has been one of terror and lynchings, burnings of their homes, destruction of their families, because these white racist Southerners want to return the South to the way that it was. So you get two different sort of opinions here. One hand, Nast seems sympathetic to African Americans. On the other hand, he seems to agree with this myth that African Americans made incompetent leaders during Reconstruction.